Thank you very much. So it's even more daunting than it is for Sadie, I suspect, to stand here because I'm not even an architect. So forgive me. I'm a designer by background, as Finn said, an interaction designer originally, and I'm sure that most of you don't know what that is. But if you've used the internet at any point, then that's designed by interaction designers or service designer, that kind of thing. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then how I've brought that work into the world of built environment over the years. And as with Sadie, also tried to get it upstream into government in various directions. So I'll talk all the way through that one way or another. The team I run at Arup is a very small team. As I'm sure you know, Arup is about 15,000 people all over the world. My team's about 10 people, stretched incredibly thinly then all over the world, across those 15,000 other ones. And I'll talk about the kind of work that we do, this kind of concept design work early on. But this is a poster we made recently, which are all drawings from the work that we've done over the last year or so. So it's funny to talk in a panel, or I think it's called Design Without Drawing or something. Actually, of course, we draw all the time. The point, I suppose, here of this diagram is that it shows the scales that we work at. Last year, we worked on a cell phone, which you can see down the bottom left there with those number pad, keypad. And we've worked on airports, in fact we work on HS2, and all points in between. And so we mashed all of these things together into this completely unreadable diagram as a result to kind of convey that. We're interested in taking almost the same practice across all of those scales, whether it's the scale of a city or a city region, down to the cell phone or mobile phone in your hand. And you see the kind of questions that we're trying to get at there as well. And questioning for us is fundamental. The work that we try and do actually is what I usually call RIBA stage -1. Maybe even -2. And that's, I think, hugely important in Sadie's presentation, was, for me anyway, was the slide with the lawyers and those wigs. And understanding, as Sadie said, that there are design decisions being taken at that point, unconsciously often, or not understanding that they're design decisions. There's not really a language of that about it, but that of course frames almost everything that follows, one way or another. We also do the +8 stage as well, if you like, as in we're very interested in the occupied stage of things, as in the way that people experience places, buildings, cities, etc., etc. And in a way we start at that end in order to then drag back to, well, what is the question in the first place, which is, you know, a line that I completely draw from Cedric Price. Given that a lot of our work is actually often to do with technology, or to the way that clients come to us and say, can you give us a digital strategy or tell us about technology? And I usually say, well, I suppose so, if we have to, but I don't really want to. Actually, at that point, if someone says, can you give us a digital strategy for this building or railway? I kind of say, well, yeah, but what's your other strategy? You know, do you have a non-digital one at this point as well? I mean, you can't really separate them. So I think what was interesting about this question, which Cedric posed in 1965 or thereabouts, was looking at the technology of the time. Let's say the motor car, most obviously, was beginning to quite radically change cities. Obviously it had been since the 1930s in a way, but at that point was seriously beginning to cause cities to be carved apart. And I like to think what he was saying there was, let's have a conversation about the kind of city we want in the first place and how we want to move around it, then we can talk about the technology. And that's exactly the principle we take. So as a result of that stepping back, we take this very, very holistic starting point as a result. And it's completely different to, you all know that's Le Corbusier's hand floating over, I guess, Plan Voisin or equivalent. It's not that kind of design as a result. We're not in control of all of the information. We're not moving blocks around on a board in front of us and pretending that that's what's going to happen, any more than Plan Voisin in a way actually happened. It's really, really different on the ground work. So the really important things, actually, to me at this point then, are not technical questions, if you like, whether we'll have autonomous vehicles and how that'll impact HS2 or those kinds of things. It's actually far more fundamentally about politics and ownership, the dynamics of those things, how they affect our identity, culture. And those are things that design delivers. Those are things that design can be used to unpick. That's what design is about in the way. It's about impact, it's about culture, it's about politics. And we need to wrestle with that directly and engage with that. And I borrow hugely here from a friend and colleague, the architectural historian Wouter van Stavoet in the Netherlands. And he said in a conversation with Rory Hyde in his book, Future Practice, a few years ago, the bit in red there is the key bit. If we really want to change the city, in a way, reading between the lines, it's not really about making the best building we can at this point. It's about engaging with these, what he called the dark matter, the structures and institutions, which I then wrote a whole book about, just that one phrase, dark matter. But understanding that the building codes, for instance, directly define the way the city is produced, one way or another. We can't experience that. When you as architects can read that as you're walking around, no doubt. You understand the setbacks, the height limitations, all of those things. The average punter doesn't, but the city is an output of that as much as anything. So directly addressing the code that writes the city, whether that's governance, culture, building codes, law, regulations, these kinds of things, as mundane as that sounds, is in a way the most powerful thing that we could do. So that was the subject of what we then started calling strategic design. How do you use design to unpick what to do in the first place? And then what kind of tools can you address that with? So there are some skills that, whoops, I'll go back one, sorry. It's a bit laggy. There are some skills that design has, I think in particular architecture, that are fundamentally useful here. It's an integrative practice. So it's capable of standing in the middle of tons of other disciplines and corralling that together into a coherent vision of some kind. So the architect's role, as you all know, is to do that exactly on a job, but that's massively useful in all kinds of other contexts. Probably the work that Sadie is doing, I think, on the National Infrastructure Commission and related places, is that integrative thinking. And then making that tangible in some way. Visualization is one way of doing that. Drawing would be the simpler way of putting that. Communicating that, prototyping, storytelling, these kinds of things. And then stewardship, making sure something happens through the project. The goal of this stuff isn't, again, making a better building at this point, I would argue, as important as that is. The goal has to be, how do we address more complex things, wicked problems? How do we deal with public good at this point? How do we see the city is about the public good at this point, when, as was pointed out in the introduction, most of it now is currently being led through private capital as regards architecture. And we're not making any impact on the kind of wicked problems that we need to address. So a simple wicked problem would be housing. A more complex one is climate change. Either way, we're making very little impact on that, I would argue, as designers currently, unfortunately. Not for want of trying, and not for because we don't want to, just because of the way that we're addressing the problem. We're not moving ourselves upstream enough, and we're not using the skills that we have in that context, in the stage -1, in the right way, systematically. So I'll just show this briefly, just to again make the point that we do drawings in this kind of work. This is a project we just finished doing the concept design for, and this was an understanding of, this is a city in China in case you can't tell by the way that it's drawn. Understanding really the impact of digital technology. Now we don't convey that in terms of, well, it's to do with 5G cables and things like that, because it's not to do with that. It's to do with how directly does that change the urban environment. How can we get private cars out of cities as much as possible, for instance? We can absolutely do that using tech. And by tech, I mean a bike as much as I mean an autonomous shuttle. There's a different way of thinking about that, which then is played out in these kinds of drawings. But fundamentally, then, we pull it down to the human scale. So these are the further drawings we do about the details in this drawing. We'll go down to this level. This is all -1 stage still. We're not saying this is a natural design. We're not saying it's even a schematic drawing or anything like that. This is all making tangible the impact of otherwise unseen things on the way that the city happens, on the way that buildings happen. This is exactly the work that we can do. We often use video for this. These are all what I call sketch videos. I'd argue this is a kind of drawing as well. These are videos that we make in the team. It's pretty quick to make this stuff now. If you have, actually you could do it on your smartphone, but certainly with Adobe After Effects or equivalent. These are all trying to understand how do these technologies directly affect the way the city works, one way or another. This one in the bottom left to do with autonomous shuttles, one in the top right to do with how is privacy and identity handled in a city of the near future, the one in the middle at the bottom to do with these very simple displays you could imagine dropped into places like Hyde Park. One in the top left was prototyping next generation cycling experiences for the GLA and TfL at the time. It's incredibly powerful as a sketch. But again, these are made over a few days, literally sometimes a few days and filmed in our office just to make it tangible. This is something that, again, that design is entirely about, in a sense, is the flows and the movement and the interactions and the touch points, the way you use something. But we don't do this enough, I think. And just to be clear, we're very, very rarely commissioned to do that, by the way. We drop it on the client as a result. What we're trying to flesh out there, though, is that you can't just take that view of, say, individual interactions when it comes to the city. So those of you that have heard of something called Uber will be aware of its impact on cities, no doubt. And it's a complex beast when you approach it from a design point of view, because if you just look at that through the practice of interaction design and service design, as in the digital designers that make something like Uber, which is my background, then it's an exemplary piece of work. I mean, it just works. When you pull it out of your pocket, clearly it's well done. There are 500 designers in Silicon Valley that have done a pretty good job on that. There's hundreds of others around the world that make that thing happen every day. It's fantastic interaction design. It's terrible urban design. So at the scale of the city, it's a disaster. There's about 19,000 Ubers in central London on a Friday night buzzing around, because they're largely exempt the congestion charge one way or another. So the congestion charge moved about 24,000 cars out of London over the last 10, 15 years or so. Uber's largely put them all back in again in a few years. And that's an inability to see strategically the impact of that system at the urban scale. Now that's entirely what architecture and urban planning can handle, but they are not in that conversation. They're not at TfL, looking ahead to see that thing coming and then setting a framework around it. And of course, they're not at Uber. I mean, Uber wouldn't really, that's not, in a way, that's not their problem, they would say. It is their problem because they'll get kicked out of cities left, right, and center because it's the issues that it's causing. But it's that zooming between the individual thing in your hand, the Uber, when you pop it up on your phone and it looks like there's a car magically always there, because there kind of is, because the system is incentivized to get drivers onto the road and have them circling like sharks, basically. That at the scale of the city is hugely problematic. And the zooming backwards and forwards between the scale in the hand and the scale at the cities, and again, what architects do all the time. You think of Juhani Palasma talking about how the door handles in Helsinki are the handshake of the city, you know, that sort of, that interplay. Or Eliel Saarinen's always design a chair in the context of a room in the context of a house in the context of a street, and so on. But zooming up and down the scale is entirely what architecture is trained to do. It is not currently, outside of our work, maybe outside of Sadie's work, it's not currently enough in the room when those conversations are being had. There's no way of addressing it. So when, this is one of the lesser known Rogers, I suppose, Richard's uncle, I think, who said the architect's job is to design from the spoon to the city, which is a very typically ambitious way of putting it in Italian design philosophy. But still, it's kind of fantastically interesting if you think about that, because that's exactly what the previous slide was about. Uber is great interaction design, but terrible urban design. We need to look at those things both simultaneously. An example of that, actually, you're seeing politicians trying to figure this out now, taking almost Cedric's thing at face value. Not that Jean-Louis Misika, the deputy mayor of Paris, knows who Cedric Price was, I suspect, but he said last summer in red there, we should announce before 2020 that in Paris, no privately owned autonomous vehicle will be allowed. It's only mobility as a service, not mobility as ownership. That's fantastically interesting. There is no deputy mayor in the UK saying that at all at the moment, which is really interesting and problematic. As in what he's saying there is, we as Parisians need to understand how we, and convey and discuss how we want Paris to get around. Then we can set the agenda for companies like Tesla and Mercedes-Benz and Google and others. Otherwise, they'll be set on their terms, not Paris's terms. This is, again, work that architects and planners can be doing right now, to be in that debate and advising and saying, this is how that would work, by the way. Then he is capable of saying it in that sense. And that's hugely important. We've got about 2 or 3 years to make these kinds of rule sets for the next 10, 15 or so. So our practice runs like this. We do this research work heavily, and to begin with, I'll show you some of that in a second. It's often user research, ethnography. Again, my background is a digital designer. You do months, years of user research before you think about making an app or something on the iPhone. You then get that to a concept and prototype and iterate as rapidly as possible. As you know, that's not traditionally how architects are asked to approach the job, as much as you might want to. But that's exactly what we do. And at some point, we might end up at RIBA stage 0. Quite rapidly, sometimes in days, weeks, but we can end up at that point. Then we can write a brief. Then we can handle procurement. Then we can open up the right conversation in the right way. So for instance, University of Melbourne, who have a beautiful campus down there in Melbourne, as you might imagine, asked us to look at the user experience for the campus because they were kind of vaguely aware that it was going to be hampered due to massive construction projects over the next 10 years. A new metro, 2 or 3 new buildings. And they knew that the user experience of the campus was a huge differentiator for them. That's one of the, if you look at their prospectus, that's kind of what they sell themselves on, as well as their academic quality, although you can go to many other colleges in Melbourne who are equally good in a sense. The user experience of the place is fundamental. They didn't really know what user experience was. They just sort of had an inkling that that's probably quite important. Can you tell us about it? So we helped them do that one way or another. And the first thing we do, of course, is we research. So we talked to students. We talked to students so that you don't have to, basically, because they rabbit on for hours. But when you ask them about themselves. But what this guy was saying was that I get to college at 9. I've got about 2 seminars, and I'm there till about 8 p.m. Just going and going. I mean, that's it. And he's actually living on campus. What the college was seeing was the 2 seminars. That's the kind of most obvious touch point with the academic system. But the rest of the time, he's living on campus. He's trying to do laundry, he's hanging out, he's having a beer, he's doing studying and things like this. So we gave them a way of thinking about that, the whole entirety of the experience, not just the 2 touch points that the formal system sees. So we did about, 20, 25 interviews like that. Then we do observational work, and we're seeing completely inappropriate use of bits of kit around campus. As you can imagine, anybody that knows a campus sees this all the time. This is an HD monitor, like a 40-inch monitor, flipped on its side, showing the staff directory, which is nuts. I mean, that staff directory changes about once every 6 months, I don't know, maybe. This thing is made for showing Mad Max in HD, 30 frames a second. It's ridiculous in a way, but that's kind of an unthinking procurement of we should just go and buy a bunch of screens and then, I don't know what we're going to do with them, but throw out the staff directory. There's numerous ways you could do that. What we've worked with them on, to cut a long story short, is an e-ink display, a bit like a Kindle, which is about this big, which uses hardly any energy. It lasts for 3 or 4 weeks if it's not changing. It works in bright sunlight. It's relatively robust. All of those things that a Kindle will do for you, that kind of thing, like a big Kindle, basically. And that slow information is right for that slow display. You don't need this to do that. This is pumping out energy all the time. It's just not the right thing. We also spotted tons of, this is one of my favorite bits of wayfinding ever. This is an arrow pointing up some stairs next to the stairs, So you kind of, I suppose you can go down, to be fair. So, I mean, maybe it's... So we looked at the food that they're putting into students. That, of course, massively impacts the way students perform, but they hadn't thought about that as part of the problem. We looked at the Google campus, where we were also working on their wayfinding strategy, and of course they put good food into their staff because they want their staff to perform well, basically. It's as simple as that. You put fuel in them and they'll do that. If you put bad food in, then they'll get sugar crashes and so on. So we did all of that, working through this day in the life stuff at the top, these outputs at the bottom. These things don't exist yet. This is us understanding what to make in the first place. Then we do the concept design. Then we come up with a kit of parts version of that, because it makes sense to combine those things into a design system. Then we'll play those things out. Then at some point, you end up with, these are renders of the e-ink display, the renders of the pop-up bits of campus and so on, this kit of parts approach. So we then finally end up at a concept design for some buildings in this case, as well as a wayfinding system, as well as a food strategy. And that's really fundamental. So we went from people to buildings as opposed to doing the building and then shoving people into them, which is a 180-degree flip usually on the whole process. But we also said there's multiple ways you do this. A building is just one of the pieces. It can't be the only thing you do. So finally, I'll just wrap up with another example from Helsinki of this. We tried to understand what was going on around food in the city when I was working there, because food is very useful in understanding systemic change, climate change, carbon, migration, urban planning, all kinds of things. What was happening in the city at the time was that it was incredibly difficult to open a small cafe or street food joint because the regulations were impossible. You had to fill in about 15 forms in triplicate. It meant that everything was optimized towards making sausages for drunk people late at night, basically, in kiosks that could be hosed down in the morning. Meanwhile, Finns had been to places like Berlin and Stockholm, and they knew that nice street food was available. So what they did was, instead of moaning about that for years, like an English person would, they said, okay, everybody in the room, all set up a little cafe from your first floor window on Saturday, and we'll start selling it, and they can't arrest us all, basically. And that's what happened. So that woman is making egg and bacon muffins in her first floor kitchen window and lowering it to the street, and you put €5 in the basket. It's called ravintolapäivä, restaurant day in Finnish. It's totally illegal. She doesn't have a permit to do any of this. There's no environmental health documentation. It's completely illegal, but wonderful. This is an Argentinian woman making empanadas. That's a woman dressed as an empanada in the foreground to advertise what's going on. This is what happens when you let people take over the city in this sense. They are trying to make the city better, and they're taking it into their own hands, exploiting some loopholes where they could, in this case, actually just strengthen numbers. And the fact that it was so intrinsically good, the city couldn't touch them. This is a Thai soup kitchen in the park. Same thing. They used Facebook to organize. They made 4 mobile apps over a two-day hackathon. Imagine running that through a public procurement process. That would take 6 months. They did it in 2 days. The issue was that they used things like these kioskis, which are around in Helsinki and amazing, but they were often like this, because actually to get into those and run something in it, you had to take out a 2-year lease on it. Now, if you think I can sell some sushi in there, or maybe I can flog an espresso, you can't. That's too risky to take out a 2-year lease. So nothing happened. So this is dark matter in action again. The leasing structure was stopping the city being activated. It wasn't the building. The building was already there. So what we did then was we ran a school, actually, and it wasn't a cooking school, because clearly they could cook. It was a school to do with the dark matter of starting up a food business. How do you fill in the forms? How do you get through this process? How do you get past the regulations? How do you design a space? How do you design a menu? How do you find staff? How do you find organic local food produce if you need those for your suppliers? And that's what we did. We ran an open competition for people to apply. It was kind of like a Finnish MasterChef in a funny way, but with the goal of addressing climate change, migration, and urban planning, which is what we started with, but food is one of the best ways you can talk about that. So we got a very diverse set of applicants. We worked with the top chefs in the city to coordinate the thing, because it was in their interest to increase the level of food culture in Helsinki. We produced and communicated all around it. So we wrote about the history of food culture in Helsinki, the issue about the regulations being blocked, and why that might be, not for any bad reason, just because things hadn't been updated and so on. And crucially, we work with the city of Helsinki. This is the City of Helsinki Food Culture Project Manager, Ville Relander. So he was part of the team, and he's then able to absorb this information about this kind of insurgency event, and then the ravintolapäivä stuff, and then fold that into the way the city works. So we ran through the whole thing. It was fine. It was a great process. But what was key was the outcomes. So I look back a few years later, because it's hard to trace the impact of this work when you're on the ground setting this up. But what we did see that over the course of the years since 2012, 2011, 13, you'll see this slow opening up of the regulations from the police, from the city, from all kinds of things about the way that, say, alcohol licensing or street food was being engaged. So I'd really argue this is fundamental, even to the extent that finally the city hired the insurgency movement, and the restaurant they founded, Timo Santala, as the food culture project strategy team. So the system actually then learned from this insurgency in a way, as a result of us as designers pulling that together and integrating it and thinking about, well, how would you change the city? Do you change the city through buildings? You can, of course, and you do, but it's a slow process, and that's its value. How do you also change it through fast processes simultaneously, and understand the relationship between the slow process, the kioski that had been there since 1930, and then the fast process, which is food culture, in the sense, and glue them together in a new way. So I'm going to skip just to the final point here about this. We did a lot of work on participation as part of that as well. And there's just a couple of things to leave you with. One is that I talked a lot about digital stuff. Sometimes the tool might be very, very lo-fi. So we worked with Sheffield this year a lot on their planning consultation around the city centre plan. If we'd taken what Sheffield Planning Department, with all due respect to them, and sorry if there's anybody in the room from the planning department, had put in front of the public, we'd have got a very low participation, incredibly low engagement. What we did as a team was we said, you can't put those drawings in public like that. You just can't in that way. So Agostino in my team, bless him, got a 3D model of the city that we happen to have, printed it out, traced it by hand, every single street in the city centre, and then we drew these vignettes indicating things that are different about the plan going forward. So instead of a rather dry piece about deculverting the rivers, we talked about catching fish in the city centre for the first time in probably 300 years. And that was making it come alive in a way. And that was what's used in the public consultation. So this guy, who seemed to be about 140 years old, as far as I can tell, was looking at this bit of the drawing in the top left there and saying, that's where my granddad used to keep cows. You know, and that drawing completely unlocked that conversation in a way that the 3D model wouldn't have done, in a way that the planner's diagram certainly wouldn't have done. So just to say, what we're trying to do is find the right tool to unlock the right conversation at the right point. That could be, in this case, a drawing, literally a pen drawing. It could be an augmented reality platform. It could be an event, as we did with Restaurant Day. And I think we as designers need to understand the impact of that and then figure out which tool to use for which job. It could be the building code, for example. It could be a law. This project we did in Helsinki was a new building. We wanted to make it a cross-laminate timber for obvious reasons. You couldn't do that then because the building code said you can't make a tall building out of timber, a relatively tall building. So our lawyers at the time, we changed the law. We changed the building code in Finland to actually enable cross-laminate timbers at scale to be built. Subsequently, that meant our building could get built, of course, but then there's now a ton of other buildings going up, including the new city library there, which is a hugely timber-based building in some way. So our building, the building that we worked on, as a single building, would not have changed much in a sense. Not that it's a bad building, it was a very good building in its own way, but changing the building code changes the way you write the city. And that is the fundamental. I think that was the biggest design shift we made there. So understanding that, I think, to Sadie's point as well, the law is code in that sense. It's a code that produces things. Think of it almost like computer code in that sense. And as designers, that could be our job as much as anything, to address the systems that define what we can then do with the city and what the city does itself, not just focus on the end point of a building. I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.